Ron Jetter here with session 8 of 9. Boy, we're nearing the end of these. Today I wanted to look at grief in the Bible, specifically the Jewish and Christian scriptures. And you may want to replay this, or if you have pencil and paper handy, you can write down the verses as well and then look them up yourself. And then ask questions like, what was lost? Who lost it? Who's grieving? What were their feelings? Are the feelings expressed or are they implied? What do you learn from this passage? The earliest loss then, Genesis 3, verses 6 through 19. What was lost with the loss of innocence, with the taking of that forbidden fruit from the garden, and then the subsequent punishment of Adam and Eve? Genesis 6, 5 through 7. We have the first murder. What is God grieving and how does God feel? Oftentimes we see in the scriptures an expression of emotions of God. Sometimes it's tenderness, sometimes it's indignation, and sometimes it's in between. Genesis 22, 1 to 13. Why does God test Abraham? And the idea of saying, take your own son and prepare for me a sacrifice. What does this say about God? Can God be counted upon to aid us in our grief? Or is God sometimes the one who causes grief? Or is God indifferent to our grief? What do you think? What does your gut tell you? Genesis 37, 3 to 19 and 31 to 35. The sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel. What becomes more important to the sons than loyalty to family? And how does their father react when he brings news that his son Joseph has been eaten by wild animals? Not knowing the brothers have lied to their father and sold Joseph into slavery. Exodus chapter 1, 15 to 22, chapter 2, 23. What have the Israelites lost? How does Israel, the nation, react to their situation? Exodus 11, 1 through 6. What is the justification for what God is doing to Egypt? And why does it relate to what Egypt did to Israel? How will Egypt react? The well-known story of Job, chapter 1, verses 13 to 21. What has Job lost and what is his initial reaction? How does Job's reaction strike you? None of us would want to put ourselves in Job's shoes. Job 17, 1 through 8. How does Job now feel when he looks at his life? The prophets. Isaiah 53, 2 through 10. How does God feel about Israel's transgressions? What does God choose to do in God's grief? That is to say, what does God's grief cause God to do? What does our grief cause us to do? One of the things people have sometimes said is, well, it's not okay to question God. Why? Because God can't handle it? Abraham questioned God. Moses questioned God. Job questioned God. Isaiah questioned God. Jeremiah, oh my goodness, over and over, what a complainer. But it was righteous complaint, holy lamentation. So precious that we preserved it in Scripture. Is it okay to complain to God, to accuse God, to yell at God? Or are we afraid God can't take it or will he be mad at us? What's wrong with being honest to God? Doesn't God want our feelings to be shared openly? Is God not the one who said he would walk with us through the valley of shadow and death? That we would dwell in his house forever? Now, the Christian scriptures. One of the things I have heard from Christians is, well, it's not right for Christians to grieve because we believe that there's heaven, that there's resurrection. Oh, really? So that becomes the reason to stuff down and silence and deny our grief? What about these? Matthew 17:22. Jesus has just told the disciples he will die. How did the disciples react to him telling him this? He tells them he'll be raised. How do they react to that? Mark 14:32-39. When a loss is pending, we may suffer what's called anticipatory grief. This is not uncommon with people who are on hospice and their family members. They know a death is in the future. There's still life, but the life will end. They anticipate death. They anticipate grief. How is Jesus' grief different from that of the disciples? He's the one who's going to die. What does Jesus say he feels? What do the disciples feel? Luke 8:40-42, 49-56. I'll let you look those up. John 11, the story of Mary and Martha. If Jesus already knew the outcome of the events of the day, that he would arrive 6 days after the death of his friend Lazarus, 4 days after he had already been buried in a tomb, why did Jesus arrive at the tomb and grieve? Why did he break down and weep? Why did Jesus cry? If he was then going to say, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus, be alive. If Jesus grieved, why do we think we need to be stronger than Jesus? Really? Jesus wept. Shouldn't we? He gives us permission in these verses to grieve with him for our losses. 1 Corinthians 15:50-54. Look that one up. How does Paul help us to grieve in this process? What does he say about the grief process? And do you find it helpful? 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18. In what ways are these encouraging words? Paul says, those who believe do not grieve as those who don't believe. Does that make it easier or harder to grieve? He isn't saying, if you believe you don't grieve. He says, grief for people of faith is different. He doesn't say it's non-existent. He doesn't say deny it. He says it's different. It has a different character, a different outcome. See you tomorrow for the final part.